I learned something strange about property lines a few years ago. The people who talk the most confidently about where a boundary is are usually the people who have never actually paid to find out. The whole thing started when my neighbors tore down my fence while I was at work, convinced they were taking back part of their yard. 7 days later, they were standing on my porch asking for mercy after discovering they had accidentally made their own backyard smaller. At the time, I lived in a quiet neighborhood outside Cedar Hollow, a growing town where people liked to pretend they lived in the country even though new subdivisions kept popping up every year. My house wasn't anything special, just a modest ranch-style place with a decent backyard, a couple maple trees, and enough space for my dog Cooper to spend his afternoons chasing squirrels he was never going to catch. I bought the house from a retired schoolteacher named Harold, and one thing I never questioned was the old wooden fence separating my yard from the house next door. It wasn't pretty. Some boards leaned slightly. A few sections had clearly been repaired over the years. But it did its job. It marked the boundary, kept Cooper from wandering, and gave everybody a little privacy. For nearly 2 years I never thought about it. Neither did the neighbors who lived next door at the time. They were an elderly couple who mostly kept to themselves. We'd wave, exchange Christmas cookies, and occasionally complain about the weather. Then they sold the house. That's when everything changed. The new owners were a couple named Brent and Melissa Turner. They arrived with 2 moving trucks, a landscaping company, and the kind of energy that immediately made the whole neighborhood pay attention. Within a month, they had painted the house, replaced every bush, installed outdoor lighting, and somehow managed to tell everybody within 3 houses of them exactly how much money they planned to invest in the property. At first, I thought they were just enthusiastic. Then I started noticing Brent staring at the fence. Not once or twice. Constantly. I'd be grilling burgers and see him standing in his yard looking at it. I'd be mowing, and he'd be pacing beside it with a tape measure. One Saturday morning, I was drinking coffee on my back patio when he walked over carrying a notebook. "You know this fence is probably on my property, right?" he said. Just like that. No hello. No small talk. I laughed because I honestly thought he was joking. He wasn't. "What makes you think that?" I asked. "I've been measuring," he said. "The lot dimensions don't add up." Now, I'm not a surveyor, but I know enough to understand that a tape measure and a guess aren't legal documents. So I shrugged and said, "Maybe we should look at the property records before anybody worries about it." His expression tightened immediately. It was the first sign that this wasn't really about finding the truth. He already believed he knew the answer. Over the next few weeks, the comments kept coming. Every conversation somehow returned to the fence. Brent insisted the previous owner must have built it wrong. Melissa started mentioning how much larger their backyard would be if the boundary was corrected. They talked about it so often that it became almost comical. One evening, another neighbor named Carol leaned over while we were both taking out trash and whispered, "Are they still talking about that fence?" I laughed. "Every chance they get." She rolled her eyes. "Good luck." Looking back, I should have recognized the warning signs. The Turners weren't interested in proving anything. They were emotionally invested in a conclusion. They wanted more yard. And somewhere in their minds they had convinced themselves that wanting something was the same as owning it. The first real confrontation happened about 3 months after they moved in. I was planting flowers near the fence when Brent appeared again. "I've decided we're replacing it," he said. I actually stopped digging because the wording caught me off guard. Not discussing it. Not considering it. Decided. "Replacing what?" I asked. "The fence. It's not your fence. It's on my property. You still don't know that." He folded his arms. "Everybody knows it." I remember looking around the empty backyard wondering who exactly everybody was. "Brent," I said, trying to stay polite, "if you want to settle this, hire a surveyor. I'll even split the cost." For a moment I thought reason might finally break through. Instead he smirked. "I don't need to pay somebody to tell me what I already know." That sentence stayed with me for months because it perfectly captured everything that happened afterward. He didn't want information. He wanted validation. Summer rolled on, and things grew tense. Not openly hostile, just uncomfortable. The kind of tension where every interaction feels like a small argument waiting for permission to become a big one. Then one Tuesday afternoon, I got a text message that changed everything. I was sitting at work answering emails when my phone buzzed. The message came from Carol. It simply said, "Did you hire somebody to tear down your fence?" I stared at the screen for several seconds. Then I read it again. My stomach dropped. I immediately called her. "What are you talking about?" I asked. "There's a contractor at your house," she said. "They're removing the fence right now." For a second, I honestly thought she had the wrong address. Then I heard machinery in the background through the phone and realized she was standing outside watching it happen. And that's when I knew something had gone very, very wrong. The drive home felt twice as long as usual. Every red light seemed personal. Every slow driver looked like an obstacle deliberately placed in my way. I kept replaying Carol's words over and over in my head. "There's a contractor at your house. They're removing the fence right now." I wanted to believe there had been some misunderstanding, maybe repairs, maybe a section had fallen down after a storm, maybe anything other than what I suspected. But deep down I already knew exactly who was behind it. When I finally turned onto my street, I could see the construction trailer before I even reached my driveway. My heart sank. The old fence was gone. Completely gone. 2 years of looking at that weathered line between our properties, and suddenly, it was just empty space. Stacks of broken boards sat piled near the curb while several workers were setting new fence posts into fresh holes. What immediately caught my attention wasn't the fact they were building a fence. It was where they were building it. The new line sat noticeably closer to my house. Even without measuring, I could tell they'd moved it several feet. Cooper was standing at the back door looking confused, like even he knew something was wrong. I parked, got out, and walked toward the workers. One of them glanced up and smiled politely. "You the homeowner?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Who hired you?" The man pointed toward Brent's yard. "Neighbor said the old fence was built on his property." I looked over and saw Brent standing on his patio with his arms crossed. He wasn't even pretending to be concerned. In fact, he looked pleased with himself, like a man admiring a problem he believed he'd successfully solved. I walked over. "Did you seriously tear down my fence?" I asked. Brent shrugged. "It was on my property." "According to who?" "Common sense." I actually laughed because the answer was so ridiculous I didn't know what else to do. Common sense isn't a survey. You had plenty of chances to move it yourself. Melissa stepped outside at that point and added, "We're just correcting a mistake." The confidence in her voice was almost impressive. They had absolutely no documentation, no survey, no legal determination, nothing. Yet they acted as though a judge had already ruled in their favor. Every instinct told me to start arguing. I wanted to point at the workers and tell them to stop. I wanted to call the police. I wanted to yell. Instead, I looked at the half-finished fence, looked back at Brent, and something unexpected happened. I got calm, really calm, because suddenly I realized this wasn't a debate anymore. This wasn't neighborly disagreement. This was now a situation where facts mattered more than opinions. And facts are much harder to argue with. "Okay," I said. Brent looked surprised. "Okay. Yeah. Finish whatever you're doing." Now he looked confused. He clearly expected a fight. "That's it?" he asked. "That's it." Then I turned around and went inside. The moment the door closed, I called a surveying company. The woman who answered listened patiently while I explained the situation. There was a brief pause before she said, "Wait, they moved a fence without a survey?" "Yep." Another pause. "Well, that's certainly confident." By pure luck, they had an opening 2 days later. I booked it immediately. The next 48 hours were fascinating. Brent expected some dramatic retaliation. Instead, I acted like nothing had happened. I walked Cooper. I watered my lawn. I went to work. The calmer I became, the more nervous he seemed to get. On the second morning, a white truck pulled into my driveway carrying professional surveying equipment. That's when the mood changed. The survey crew unloaded tripods, laser instruments, measurement rods, and bright orange boundary markers. They weren't guessing. They weren't estimating. They were establishing legal property lines. I noticed Brent watching through his kitchen window before the equipment was even fully unloaded. By lunchtime, he was outside pretending to do yard work, while secretly tracking every move the crew made. The survey leader, a middle-aged guy named Rick, spent several hours cross-checking historical records, reference markers, and county maps. It was far more complicated than most people realize. Property boundaries aren't determined by where a fence sits. They're determined by recorded legal descriptions that can stretch back decades. Around mid-afternoon, Rick approached me. "Interesting situation," he said. "Good interesting or bad interesting?" I asked. He smiled. "Depends which side of the fence you're on." That answer alone told me everything. More measurements followed. More calculations. More orange markers appeared across both properties. Then came the moment that changed everything. Rick called me over and pointed toward a marker near the back corner of my yard. That's your property line. I looked. Then I looked again. Are you sure? Very sure. The marker wasn't where Brent thought the boundary should be. It wasn't even where the old fence had been. It was farther into what everyone assumed was Brent's backyard. Suddenly, years of assumptions evaporated. The old fence, the one Brent claimed had stolen his property, hadn't been on his land at all. In fact, it had been sitting nearly 2 feet inside my property the entire time. I stood there staring at the marker while my brain caught up. The fence I'd inherited from the previous owner had actually given my neighbors extra space all these years. Not the other way around. Rick continued explaining the measurements, but I was already looking toward the Turner's yard. And that's when I saw the real problem. Their patio furniture sat beyond the newly established line. Their decorative stone fire pit sat beyond it too. So did a large section of landscaping. Then my eyes landed on something even bigger. Their garden shed. A structure Brent had proudly told everyone cost thousands of dollars. Half of it was on my property. I wish I could adequately describe Brent's face when Rick began placing additional markers. Earlier that week, he had walked around like a man celebrating victory. Now he looked like someone watching a slow-motion car crash. He marched across the yard. There has to be a mistake, he said. Rick didn't even look offended. Surveyors probably hear that every day. No mistake. The fence was over there. The fence wasn't the property line. That doesn't make sense. Rick finally looked up. Property boundaries don't care whether they make sense. That sentence landed like a hammer. For the first time since moving in, Brent had no comeback. The contractor building the new fence arrived shortly afterward. He spent about 10 minutes reviewing the survey results before quietly setting down his clipboard. Then he walked over to Brent. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I didn't need to. The contractor's body language said everything. Whatever confidence Brent had sold him earlier was gone. Work stopped immediately. No more fence posts. No more construction. No more expansion plans. By evening, the entire neighborhood knew something dramatic had happened. People aren't supposed to gossip, but neighborhoods run on curiosity the same way cars run on gasoline. Carol called me before dinner. Please tell me it's true. What's true? I asked. That they accidentally proved they own less yard than they thought. I laughed for the first time in days. Let's just say the survey didn't go the way they expected. The next few days were strangely quiet. No comments from Brent. No confident speeches about property rights. No lectures about measurements. Every time I saw him outside, he looked distracted, like someone mentally calculating a very expensive problem. And to be fair, that's exactly what he was doing. Because the survey hadn't just exposed a mistake. It created consequences. Real consequences. The new fence now sat in the wrong location. The shed violated the boundary. The landscaping crossed property lines. The patio area extended into land that legally wasn't theirs. Suddenly, all those assumptions carried a price tag. 3 evenings later, there was a knock at my front door. I opened it and immediately noticed something different. The confidence was gone. Brent and Melissa stood there looking uncomfortable, nervous, almost embarrassed. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Brent cleared his throat and asked a question I never expected to hear. Do you think we can work something out? And just like that, the people who had ignored every suggestion to verify the property line before tearing down my fence were standing on my porch hoping I would help solve the mess they had created. For a moment, I just stood there looking at them. A week earlier, Brent had been so certain he didn't need a survey because he already knew the answer. Now he looked like a man who wished he could travel back in time and stop himself from making one very expensive decision. Melissa wouldn't even make eye contact. She kept staring at the porch railing while Brent tried to find the right words. Look, he finally said. Things obviously got more complicated than we expected. I almost laughed at that description. Complicated. That was certainly one way to describe accidentally discovering part of your backyard belonged to somebody else. But I didn't say it. Truthfully, most of my anger had already faded. Not because what they did was okay, but because the survey had accomplished something arguments never could. It settled reality. There was no longer a debate about who was right. The documents had answered that question. Now all that remained was deciding what happened next. Brent explained that moving the shed would cost money. Reworking the patio would cost money. Rebuilding the fence yet again would cost money. Every sentence sounded more painful than the last. Then he finally said the thing he had probably rehearsed before walking over. We're hoping you won't make us remove everything. The irony almost knocked me over. The man who had torn down my fence without permission was now asking me for flexibility. A younger version of me might have enjoyed the moment more. I won't lie, there was a small voice in my head saying, make them move every single inch. Make them pay for everything. But another part of me knew that endless neighbor wars rarely have winners. People imagine revenge feels satisfying forever. Most of the time it just creates new problems. So I invited them inside. We sat at the kitchen table where the conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. For the first time since they moved into the neighborhood, nobody argued. Nobody interrupted. Nobody tried to dominate the discussion. We simply dealt with facts. In the end, we reached a compromise. The fence would be rebuilt exactly where the survey established the legal boundary. No exceptions. No creative interpretations. No guessing. The property line would finally match the property line. As for the shed and patio, I agreed to grant temporary access while they figured out a long-term solution. They would cover all construction costs and restore any damaged portions of my yard. It wasn't perfect, but it was fair. More importantly, it allowed everybody to move forward. Over the following weeks, I watched the consequences unfold. The new fence line changed the appearance of their yard dramatically. Once the boundary was placed correctly, the space behind their house looked noticeably smaller. Not because I gained land. I had owned that land the entire time. The illusion simply disappeared. That's what fascinated me most. Brent had spent months believing somebody had stolen part of his property, when the truth was almost the exact opposite. The old fence had actually given him extra space. Yet instead of verifying the facts, he built an entire story around an assumption. And assumptions can be expensive. The contractor returned and rebuilt the fence according to the survey markers. The shed was eventually relocated. Sections of landscaping were redesigned. Every project cost time and money that could have been avoided with a single survey at the beginning. As the months passed, things slowly settled down. Brent became quieter. Not unfriendly, just humbler. Occasionally we'd exchange a wave across the fence. Sometimes I'd catch him looking at the property markers as if they still offended him personally. One afternoon nearly a year later, he actually laughed about the situation. You know, he said, shaking his head, this whole thing would have been a lot cheaper if I'd listened to you. Probably, I said. A lot cheaper. We both laughed. And strangely enough, that was the moment the feud truly ended. Looking back now, I realized the story was never really about a fence. It was about certainty, about how dangerous it can be when people become emotionally attached to being right. Once that happens, evidence starts feeling like an enemy instead of information. Brent didn't start out trying to be a villain. He convinced himself he was correcting an injustice. The problem was that he skipped the step where he actually confirmed the injustice existed. That's a mistake people make every day, not just with property lines but with friendships, families, neighborhoods, even entire communities. We assume, we conclude, we act. Then reality shows up with paperwork. To this day, that fence still stands exactly where the survey placed it. Every time I look at it, I remember how close this situation came to becoming an ugly legal battle. Instead, it became one of the strangest lessons I've ever learned about ownership, pride, and human nature. Because sometimes the thing you think was taken from you was never yours to begin with. And sometimes the harder you push to claim more, the more you end up losing. But here's the question I still think about. If you were in my position, after they tore down your fence without permission and tried to take part of your yard, would you have forced them to remove everything from your property? Or would you have accepted the compromise like I did? Let me know down in the comments, because even now, years later, people in my neighborhood still disagree about whether I was too nice or not nice enough.